Giagwiv, hi everybody, and welcome to week 3 of the UDL Chat IE book club. The book that we are reading is Universal Design for Learning, Theory and Practice, and you can find a free multimedia version of that on the cast.org website. The chapter that I am looking at this week is chapter 3, The Variability of Learners. Last week I used a PowerPoint, and this week, because it really lent itself to my processing in the chapter, I have used categorization, just where I was able to categorize everything together. There will be a picture of that on the tweet, and I'll also include a link for people who want to download a more accessible, reader-friendly version. It's the week before the holidays and my brain has really slowed down, so bear with me today. I have been learning different things about myself, or becoming more aware about different things about myself as I've been going through the previous 2 chapters, and in particular this chapter. So I process and I learn by the physical act of writing. Whatever it is, if I type my notes, I don't have that same original thoughts from what I'm reading, or I'm not able to map it to previous things that I've read in the book, or to experiences outside the work. So that the motion of the left to the right is really important to my learning, to my processing. And what I found really interesting here is I struggled with this chapter because it's a sciencey chapter, and my brain doesn't work in a sciencey way. So I struggled with my processing, had to spend a little more time in it than I normally would. And what I noticed with my writing was that it went from this in an earlier chapter, where I was really engaged with it, was able to think in advance, use all my different colors. I have a whole color system in my head, so I was using all of that. The writing is legible for my writing. My writing isn't always very legible, but I went from that to this. Let me make sure I'm getting up to this. So all of my colors are gone. The writing is scribbled. I won't even get into the spelling in that, but I thought it was really interesting, particularly in the context of this chapter, because what this chapter is doing in its neuroscience way is telling us how the different parts of the brain are specialized in their own areas, but also interconnected. And they talk an awful lot about hierarchical networks, and that things don't just work bottom up or top down, or from left to right. That in the 3 perspectives that we're going to be talking about today, which is our recognition, or strategy, and or I've forgotten the third one already, or effective, or why of learning, that even though in the book they go through them one at a time, effective, recognition, and strategic, that there are all of these multidirectional, interdirectional flows within them, but also between them. So that's just a really interesting point to start with. And what they are saying in a nutshell, wish I could do this chapter in a nutshell, was that there's a conflict or a tension between what we know, and that is that everyone is unique, and that the ways in which we learn are to varying degrees particular to all of us. So just that process I said of writing is particular to me. The colors I use to alert parts of my brain could be completely different to somebody else who uses a writing processes and uses colors, but may have different colors. So it's particular to us in varying degrees. We may have the same strategy, but we use it in a slightly different way. But the tension lies between us knowing all of that and then how the education system is still designed in the most part for most. And it's still designed with the thinking that most learn the same way, and that therefore fair education, and they don't talk about an equitable education, it's a fair education, is one that is identical. And that's how the chapter started off before it goes into the science and the neurosciences of how our brain is working, and the advances in the understanding of our brain that shows us that this is wrong. So before I get into the three domains that they are talking about in this chapter, I'm just going to share a clip from the book that will explain the neuroscience-y bit much better than I can. So. So that's just a short introduction into the neuroscience and the three networks that we will be looking at. And just as we're going into the networks, so we are talking about, excuse me there, we're talking about the affective network, which is the why of learning. And I'll just make this a bit bigger for you, which move it over here for you, which is the why of learning, the feelings, values, or emotions that can influence attitudes towards learning. We are talking about recognition, which is the what of learning, how we identify information and categorize what we see, hear, and read. And then we are talking about the strategic network, and that is the how of learning. And it is through strategic networks that we plan, execute, and monitor our internally generated mental and motor patterns, actions, and skills. So this chapter goes through the three networks separately. So they go through the affective, the recognition, and the strategic, but there are the same themes throughout them all. So there is The theme of them being specialized, of their being heterarchical, and of their being variable. So I'm not going to actually go and talk about them in isolation. I'm going to talk about them under those headings, and just give you one key message that I found from each one. So if we start with our affective network or our engagement, for me, the key message was the central role of engagement and motivation. And this really brought me back to chapter 1 when we were talking about the power of affect on our learners, and how sometimes our strengths, or sorry, not our strengths, or our characteristics can be turned into strengths, or they can be turned into weaknesses because of the environment. And that lovely quote that I've mentioned in the last 2 chapters about our curiosity, and whether we want to feed that curiosity, or whether it is dampened because of labeling in the school. The key message for recognition, which is our representation, was this recognition is all about making sense of the world and making sense of its predictable patterns. And when I was thinking about this, I thought back to, I'm doing Shelley Moore book clubs as well, and the first book she did was Uniquely Human, and it was about how people with autism translation and interpret the world, and that if they can't make sense of the world and make sense of the patterns, it causes a sense of dysregulation, and that it's our responsibility as the educators or the adults in their lives, or their support structures for people with autism who are adults, to help them make sense and put strategies in place for their interpretation of these predictable patterns. And our expectations of what we are seeing can also warp what we do see. And that, as a learner, it's about going into something with an open mind. But as an educator, it really is about that, not labeling somebody and not judging that book by its cover, and digging deeper with your students in front of you to see why something isn't working out for them, and because of that, offering them new and alternative ways to go about it. And then the strategic, which is our action and expression, the key message there for me was about taking action on the world with purpose, and really that you just don't go into something willy-nilly, but that you have thought it out, that you purposefully organize, plan, and execute actions, and that you review and reflect on these actions, and that you make amendments if required as you go along. As I said, you need to look at the 3 of them, bottom up, top down, side to side. It's all that interaction. So they're the key messages. As you can see, they are actually really all about making sense of the world, taking action within the world, and being a part of and engaged in something. In each one then, as I said, the sections begin with why each part is specialized. And the first one, it's really interesting. I remember in one of my first UDL, introduction to UDL seminars, somebody said engagement is the hardest one to get your head around. And actually in this chapter, I found that. So if anyone got a different read of this, I'd love to hear it. But for me, what they're saying is that, well, across all the 3 sections, that you've your different part of the brain, and that part of the brain is specialized, just before we go into each one separately. But then within each part, there are specialized characteristics within that part of the brain. And that is what we're looking at here. So for the affective, it is how we respond. So do we respond bottom up or top down first, or from side to side? Does the sense, the feeling or the emotion, or the analytical, the thinking come first. And the analogy that they give in the book is fear and the whole fight or flight. And this brought me back to Shelley Moore's book club, Uniquely Human, as well, because if you are walking through the forest and you hear an unexpected sound, the physiological or the emotional reactions kick in first. You know, you stop, you look around, you tense up, your heart goes a little faster, your eyes dilate, and then you spot what the noise was. Your brain kicks in, does the analyzing, and you make a call on whether there's a reason to be afraid or not. The next time you walk in the wood, you will be aware of that noise. You will know what that noise means, and therefore you won't have that same first emotive and physiological response. You'll have the analytical response. Oh, I've heard that noise before. It's just the twig breaking under my foot. It's just the owl hooting in the tree. And going back then to the Uniquely Human book, this is about preparing students and preparing people for the unexpected to the best that we can. Like, by the very nature of unexpected, it means there are going to be difficulties, but putting patterns in place. When you walk in a wood, this may happen. When you sit an exam, this may happen. And it was another example in the chapter where they split a group, and the first group, they gave them the exam and they said it's natural to experience anxiety during the exam. And anxiety is good for you and it helps you better perform. Bear that in mind when you feel anxious. In the second group, they just said you may feel anxious and nothing else. And the group where they gave them the strategy, this will help you, this is normal, they performed better than the other group. So really, really interesting there. And that is the specialized area of the affective network. For the recognition network, which is our representation, it is, what's specialized about it is that different parts of the brain for recognition have different capabilities for recognizing patterns. So the part of, I'm not even going to try and remember where the recognition was, but the part of the brain for recognizing will have a section within that for recognizing sight patterns versus recognizing sound patterns. And they give a really good analogy of a food processor. So you can buy a food processor and you have all your different handles, and one is for blending, one is for making pastry, and so on and so forth. And that you want all of those different things, because if you're baking pie, you don't want something coming out as mush. So what they're saying is that our brain and the tissue in the brain is like that food processor, that it has a basic architecture. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in the variable section, but it's a basic architecture. So the tissue is there to recognize certain patterns, but then each section is specialized to adapt to whether it is the sight or whether it is the sound. And this is a distributed specialization that allows for parallel processing. So it allows us to process sight and sound at the same time. And in chapter 2 last week, we talked about distributed intelligence, where we don't expect everyone to have a little bit of knowledge in everything, but not be an expert in anything. It's the same here. We want our different parts of the brain to specialize in that area to make it work best for us, but to have that overlap. We talked about the fish analogy last week, to have that overlap so that they can work together in tandem. And then for the last thing in the recognition for me was that for us as educators, what this is telling us is that we need to design our lessons and our activities for the implicit and the unexpected demands on the students, as well as the demands that are central to the task. And in week 1, I spoke about the learning outcome where a student needs to tell a story, but the demand is writing, and we lose what we wanted was the creativity and the storytelling to the demand of writing, because that could overtake for some students. So as teachers, we need to not just see the last step, because we are experts in this area. So we're thinking, okay, this is the last step, but we actually need to think of all of the habits and all of the practice and all of the unconscious things that we do to get to that last step. And remember that they could be a demand on the student sitting in front of us for a multitude of different reasons. So that's recognition. And moving on to strategic then, it says that in terms of being specialized, that different areas of the brain specialize in different aspects of doing. So for example, the motor cortex is, the specialist area is on moving. But specialist areas, they're not static, they don't remain the same, and they are altered by learning. So both the genetic, the biological functions, and the experiential factors are both important for our learners. And they give the example of taxi drivers who their hippocampus change due to the environment. And they talked about London taxi drivers and how their hippocampus grew. So they were tested over a couple of months, and their hippocampus grew to accommodate the learning of the streetways and the directions and all of those different things. And this harps back to chapter 1 and chapter 2 again, where you talk about the interaction between the individual and the context and the environment, and how important that is. And just bearing in mind that that environment is impacting the learning, and the learning is impacting that specialist area of the brain. So if we keep learning, keep practicing, and keep challenging, then we are going to continue to be developing in that aspect of the brain. So moving on then to the heterarchical. So in the affective, they were saying that this is about creating conscious strategies for interpreting and responding to emotional responses. So again, going back to that fear, when you get that sense of fear and you start using the brain to analyze it, what strategies are you putting in place? So you are saying, okay, sounds may happen in the wood. These are what the sounds are. I can just keep walking and it will all be okay. And then it goes into talking about the link between cognition and emotion and the interdependency that we talked about in chapter 2, and how we move from that sense of dysregulation where we are finding it difficult to think this through, where there is that sense of fear or that sense of anxiety, to actually moving from that and giving ourselves and our students steps to re-regulate and get ourselves on track so that we can engage in the lesson or the activity that is going ahead. And that can be as simple as having the same routine before doing an exam. I talked about my routine here with my colors, my writing and my colored pens. And if I don't have those colors, if I'm missing a color, I can't start a chapter. Now, some people would call that procrastination. Off to the shops, get a Diet Coke, takes an hour to get that color. But that is part of my strategy. And even if it does take an hour, when I come back, I have everything there and I'm ready to go. So comfort blanket maybe, but it is all about having those conscious strategies that help you and your students to process through a lesson or an activity and to make progress within it. In terms of recognition, the Hierarchical networks are about prediction and patterns, and they're about, very simply, making use of our prior knowledge and our experiences and our context, and the overall all pattern. So just when we talk about UDL, we talk about prior experiences and learning, and bringing our strengths and our preferences to our strategies. This is what it's talking about here. And it gives a really good example of learning to read and what they call the phonics war. I'm not a primary school teacher. I wasn't aware there was a phonics war, but perhaps there is. And just the original thinking was that you learnt your letters. So you learnt your A, B, C, and then the brain kicked in and you started forming words. Whereas the most recent thinking is the opposite of that, that the patterns come first, that you start recognizing words. This is why it can be difficult for people with dyslexia, because the patterns and the letters and the words get mixed up, but that you recognize the patterns and then the letters come after that. And that because of this, there is now sort of a blended approach between the phonics and the word patterns when our beginner learners are starting to learn how to read. And that actually moves us really nicely into the strategic part of the hierarchical networks, because what they're saying here is that there's more than one simple action, and rather that one action is embedded in a much larger hierarchical network. So when we think of that lesson we design, that when we are asking someone to write a story, that everything that comes to getting to that end visible goal of writing needs to be taken into consideration. And that it's about the bottom up here. So it's about thinking about the sequencing, the coordinating those lower functions, the stimulating muscles to action. So stimulating our hand or motor functions to do the writing. And it's about moving up from that to our executive functioning. So or planning or monitoring or amending the plan or our higher order functions. So that we start at the basic and then we work our way up. So we learn that writing skill, we separately learn a telling the story skill, we put the two of those together, we make a plan to write that story that we're doing, or to make that argument, or to complete that project. So you can see again how the three, effective, recognition, and strategic, are all overlapping within the hierarchical, just like they did with the specialized. And then finally, the authors talk about the networks being variable. And in terms of the effective network, here they're talking about the diversities between and within learners, and between and within time, between and within context. So pulling everything that we've learned in the last two chapters about the interactions and the interconnection between all of these different things and the learner, and one not working without the other. So no siloing of these, thinking of them all together in the same pot. And that there needs to be manipulation of the learning environment for positive affective states. So that is the putting the strategies in place, giving the students the options to engage with the learning environment in ways that suit their learning. And if you think back to last week when we talked about the Rubik's Cube design, which is the medium for learning, and that was the learning environment, that if we handed, excuse me, if we handed the just colored Rubik's Cube to a blind person, they can't access it. And if we hand the all white with Braille Rubik's Cube to seeing people and blind people who don't read Braille, they can't access it. But if we hand everyone the Rubik's Cube that has colors and has a a shape that you can feel per color. So I think green was triangle, that everyone is using the same medium, but it's accessible to them all. And the learning environment was manipulated to address those diversities between and within. And that's what's really, really important in the effective and the engagement. And that's where I actually got hooked. The rest, again, it is quite scientific, but here for me, so it's the emotions that hook me. Something else I've learned about myself. So here, when it talked about making things accessible for everyone, that's where this all came together for me. And moving then into the recognition and why these diversities and manipulating the learning environment for positive effect is important, is because brain architecture for recognition is basically the same. It's the makeup that's variable. So it's the autonomy, the connectivity, and the physiology. So again, going back to that Rubik's Cube, the basic structure of the Rubik's Cube did not change. It was a square with 4 or 5 colors. You move them around. But what changed with the final redesign was that it still had the colors, but it had the shapes, and that it was accessible to everybody. So it was accessible to the seeing person and to the blind person in that. So therefore, it wasn't the internal barriers, it was the external barriers. And we talked about that in, excuse me, in the hierarchical areas where you have to look at both. You have to look at the biology and you have to look at the environment. And by doing that, they got the perfect accessible Rubik's Cube for the group of learners. So it goes on from there to say that all of this manifests in the way we recognize the world, and our recognition, our strengths and our weaknesses and our own preferences. And that if those preferences are there, are an option for us, if our strength, our strongest strategy is an option for us, then we are going to recognize the world in a much more positive and engaging way than if something external in the environment is putting up a barrier for us accessing them. And it comes back to recognition and context, and we talked about the importance of context in chapter 1 as well. And they give a really interesting analogy in this chapter, in this story, and I see can I find it and play it at the end. But it is about this recognition and context, and Todd Rose talks about astrophysicists with dyslexia, and the astrophysicist with dyslexia has a strength that astrophysicists with really good reading skills are actually envious of, and that they would choose this skill over their skill of reading. So really, when we're talking about that recognition and context, that really shows the difference. You know, we put value on literacy and reading, but actually for some jobs that isn't the be all and the end all, and that isn't what's important. So I will play that video at the end for you, just so you can have a little listen to it. But yeah, that came across as something really, really interesting to me. So moving on from that, then we're into our final part, and we're into then what's variable about the strategic networks. And this is where it's bringing it all together, really. For me, it's retelling us and reaffirming our knowledge that students' variabilities and diversities affect very specific aspects of strategic skills. So if you are a student with dyslexia, one of your strategies is not going to be reading the text. You might prefer something that is visual, or you might prefer something that is audio, and you may use graphic organizers as your way to express your knowledge, rather than the traditional option of having to write that 3-page essay. So that's one that I think is really interesting there. And then context again, going back to age, stage, strengths, weaknesses, and preferences. What works for one and what works for where you are at the continuum doesn't mean that it's the same for everybody else. And we watched those videos last week. I think it was Ellie, the beginner learner, and the strategies she put in place, and Mason, who needed support in actually finding the strategies that worked for him. But when he did, he's now a solicitor, and that's proof that this works. So just really, really interesting there. The chapter ended just talking about the implications of this on education, and the implications are they're self-explanatory, really, because what this is showing us is that we really do need to move away from labels, because nothing about these networks enables us or supports the categorization of our learners into labels, or into boxes where this is what we're deciding is the way we're going to do it. But also for us as teachers, that we aren't just thinking of the one strategy, that, you know, we're becoming good designers, and that we're thinking in a way and we're designing in a way that is reaching our learners. They can recognize the patterns, and they can they can choose the strategies that work best for those. And they can put strategies in place in advance as well. And that's really, really important. And that, going back to a point that I made earlier, is that none of these strengths and weaknesses reside entirely within the learner, whether it's the brain or the genes, and that it's not static and it's not fixed, and it's that intersection between the individual and the environment, which has come up in the last 2 chapters as well, that is what is making UDL what UDL is, and why it makes sense to move away from labeling and to have all of these options there for our learners, so that they can predict the patterns and they can make sense of the world around them, and that they can progress within it. So that is the chapter for today. An interesting one. It is the science one. It's the chapter before the UDL chapter itself, which is coming next week. And there's a lot in it. There are some really good videos that I would recommend going and having a look at throughout this chapter. I actually found the videos really helped me when I was trying to make sense of it. There's one about the marshmallow test there. It's on page 41 when we're talking about the strategic networks. That was really good. Pointing out that you've probably heard of it, where the kids are put in a room and they're told if they don't eat the one marshmallow in front of them, that when teacher comes back, they will get a second marshmallow. And it's really interesting to watch that, and just see the kids and their reactions. But also they talk about all of the different invisible actions that went into their strategic thinking on whether they're going to eat the marshmallow or not. First of all, the recognition of the white marshmallow in front of them, the movement, the reaching out, the touching it, the not touching it, the sitting on their hands, making all of the different plans to see whether it did work or not. So that's the end of today's. I'm just going to see, can I find the video? Okay, I'm just going to see, is this it? So bear with me. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen and play this and say goodbye, Sloan, and see you next week for our UDL chapter. Have a really nice week and talk to you then. Bye, Sloan.